The BIS just released their plan for a global central bank digital currency. In other words, the global elite have just revealed their Marxist agenda to control your life. In fact, the head of the IMF just came out and announced their plan for this global CBDC.
At the IMF, we are working hard on the concept of a global CBDC platform.
I'm going to explain what this is, why it should scare the hell out of you that they're even talking about this, and what you can do to push back in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over WTF, this whole monstrosity, this global CBDC actually is. What they're calling it is a unified ledger. In their words, it's a tokenized, programmable platform. If this doesn't make any sense, don't worry about it. We're going to go over it thoroughly in this video. So it starts off with the real world. Here, very simple example of assets, private property. We've got dollars, houses, and cars. Well, in this unified ledger, it's really a parallel system. So what they do first and foremost is tokenize all of the assets and private property in the real world. So tokenize sounds really fancy, but it's actually not that fancy. So what they're doing is they're saying, okay, you've got $1,000 in your checking account. We're going to go ahead and turn those $1,000 into this digital token, which is just a representation of what you have in the real world. But this token is going to include rules, what that asset can and cannot do. And who do you think determines who those rules are? That would be Klaus Schwab. I'm just using him as a proxy for the global elite, central planners, and authoritarians. But it's also going to include information, a lot of data that they get in real time from the real world. And once it's tokenized, then it goes on to this global unified ledger. So there's one ledger, one database for all of the assets and most of the private property for every single person that is part of this system, which would represent probably at least 5 of the 8 billion people on the planet Earth. Then once everything is tokenized and put onto the unified ledger, and we'll just call this Klausville, because in a way it's a lot like a video game, that if you could just take your assets and put them onto the video game and then trade them back and forth on the video game, it would happen instantaneously, right? So I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but if you could just think about this unified ledger as a video game, they're tokenizing all of your stuff and then putting it into that video game. But what happens in Klausville is actually legally binding in the real world. So main takeaways, assets and private property now have information and rules attached to them, such as ownership, changes in the assets or property, or individual transactions. And what happens up here, like we said earlier, is legally binding. And usually, in order to buy, let's say, a house, in other words, a token of a house, you would have to pay for that with other tokens. More on that in step number 2, where we talk about why this should scare the hell out of you. Let's go over a quick example to make sure everyone's on the same page. Make sure you're getting your head around this. Let's assume for a moment that you lease a car. Okay, so that car or a token of that car would live on the unified ledger. Your bank account would also be tokenized. Every single dollar you have would also be on the unified ledger. And what happens when you lease the car is they would create a smart contract that said, let's say you're paying $500 a month to lease this car. So every single month, that $500 worth of tokens would go into the tokenized account of whomever is leasing you the car. But there would be additional data because obviously the person who's leasing or entity who is leasing you the car wants to know things like, well, how many miles are you driving? Okay, well, that data would go into the unified ledger and into the token in real time. Also, where are you driving? Obviously, we need to know that. And how are you driving? Are you speeding? Because if you're speeding, obviously you're putting that car at higher risk. And if you do speed, then that should increase your payment from $500 a month, maybe to $550. And that's going to be included in this smart contract. And keep in mind, the entities or the individuals that will be in charge of creating these types of smart contracts and the entities that are in charge of the rules of the entire unified ledger, in other words, the people who control all the assets and the private property, would be the global elite. Step number 2. Unfortunately, the nightmare of a CBDC is far worse than you can imagine. We all know the problems about Big Brother. This turns society into basically George Orwell's 1984. They would extend credit, not based on merit, but based on narrative. So if you have a great credit score, that no longer matters. If you're likely to pay the bank back, that doesn't matter. What does matter is what your political affiliation is. What does matter is who you know. It's crony capitalism. And also, what probably matters the most is what disadvantaged group are you part of. In other words, Dylan Mulvaney will get a loan for anything he wants at pretty much any interest rate, regardless of his credit score, where you, the average viewer watching this video, may have a 750 credit score and you can't get a loan to buy a car. Why? Because you didn't wear your mask in 2020 like they told you to. And of course, we all know about them giving us a social score or maybe a climate score. But there are a lot of problems that are unknown. So let's go over this. First and foremost, the unified ledger, this tokenized programmable platform, will be very fast, extremely cheap, and incredibly convenient for transactions. Let me give you an example. Right now, I'm in Colombia, Medellin, as most of you know, and I've purchased quite a few apartments here in the past. To do this, I have to take dollars from the United States. I have to send them down to Colombia. This usually takes 2 or 3 days, takes a lot of paperwork. Then I've got to pay a fee in order to exchange those dollars and turn them into pesos. And then I've got to take the pesos from the account and then transfer them to the account of the seller. And then I get the apartment. It's a very tedious process, to say the least. But with a unified ledger, this would happen literally at the click of a button. So I would take my dollars and I would instruct the unified ledger to turn them into pesos and simply deposit them into the account of the seller. And we would have a smart contract set up so as soon as those dollars are transferred into pesos and go into the account of the seller, the property would immediately be put into my name and I would have legal ownership. Again, this would take what is now a 3-day process of having to deal with paperwork, jump through hoops, and just massive amounts of stress and headache, and turn it into something that could be done instantly just on your cell phone. And for those of you who are looking at this saying, no, George, what are you talking about? The payment rails aren't set up right now to do that. Some sort of cross-border payment where you've got to switch one currency for another currency and put it into another bank account. Yeah, what you're not understanding is the borders no longer exist. There are no borders on the unified ledger. The only thing that exists are tokenized assets or tokenized private property. So if you're trading one token for another token via a smart contract, all of those frictions that existed in the past are no longer there. And let's not forget, this would be using the exact same currencies that people are accustomed to using. In other words, the currency in which their expenses are denominated. So the advantage of holding dollars is that your mortgage payment is denominated in dollars. So are your food costs. And if you want to buy something, let's say a month or 2 months down the road, you don't have to worry about those dollars losing 20 or 50% of their value against what you're trying to buy in, let's say, 4 weeks' time. So I know for a lot of you watching this video, you say, oh, I don't care about that because I'm holding gold or Bitcoin or silver for the long run. Right, but we have to look at this through the lens of the average Joe and Jane. And for them, that is a huge advantage. So I know right about now you're saying, George, well, you're talking about these problems, but all you've done is talk about the benefits of this unified ledger in the eyes of the normies. Well, that's right, because it does have massive advantages. And I think that if we want to defeat this CBDC global elite opponent of ours, we have to be realistic about its strengths and weaknesses. An example I used on Twitter the other day, it's like going into a fight with John Jones, who's arguably the best UFC fighter of all time, and just simply focusing on his weaknesses and being totally oblivious to his strengths. Well, that is the opposite of what you would want to do if you actually wanted to beat him in the octagon. And it's the exact same thing with understanding the advantages or the strengths of this unified ledger. And I know a lot of you right about now are saying, oh, George, well, it doesn't even matter because any of these CBDCs or whatever they create, they're all going to be inflationary. Therefore, the average Joe is going to lose purchasing power over time, and they're going to gravitate to sound money. Okay, well, that's fine, but what you're missing out on is in this system, in the unified ledger, all of those dollar deposits are a liability of a central bank. See where I'm going with this? And the central bank has an infinite balance sheet. Therefore, they can pay an interest rate on savings deposits that matches or exceeds the rate of inflation. So now that turns those tokenized dollars into an asset that will not lose purchasing power against domestic goods and services. But whoa, time out here, George. What about privacy? Now, I know my neighbor isn't really in touch with what we discuss in these videos and whatnot, and they're the friend and family member Fred. They've got their head kind of buried in the sand. They think the government is their friend. But if the government steps in and tells them that they can't buy diesel or they can't buy beef, well, they're going to push back against that type of system, I can assure you. Right, but what you're assuming there is that the Klaus types are going to roll out this social credit score immediately. Of course not. They're going to get people hooked on the system. They're going to get them dependent on the network, and then they're going to roll it out. Let me give you guys a quick thought experiment. Most of you have a cell phone. In fact, I would argue every single one of you have a cell phone. You might even be watching this video on your iPhone, etc. It's become a part of your life. You cannot leave home without it. So what if I told you tomorrow the government was going to be giving you a social score based on how you use your cell phone? Would you give it up? Come on now, let's be honest. 99%, if not more of you, would continue to use that cell phone the exact same way that you use it right now, even if you knew it gave the government the information they need to give you a social credit score. So my point is one of the unknown problems that we really need to be cognizant of is for the normies, the average Joe and Jane, this unified ledger, call it Klausville, whatever, is going to be extremely popular. And it's not just assumed that they're not going to want a CBDC. It's not even assumed that it's going to be called a CBDC, and that they're just going to naturally gravitate toward Bitcoin and gold. Absolutely not. Most of the people will look at this and say, this is fantastic. Why would I want any other form of money? So we discussed known problems, unknown problems, but unfortunately, these are not our biggest problems. And we're going to get to those in just a moment. But before we do, let's go right to the BIS's report and hear in their own words how they describe this unified ledger It's a tokenized, programmable platform that should scare the hell out of you.
So we start by looking at their visual representation of the unified ledger. We've got an execution environment, data environment, and then we have external information. So let's start with the data environment. This is what we were talking about, where they basically tokenize all of the assets. So what they're calling private tokenized money providers, let's just use banks as an example, and tokenized asset providers. Those are the companies that manage the ledgers that currently keep track of who owns what, such as cars, such as stocks, such as housing, things like this, things that most people would consider kind of basic assets. And in the execution environment, this is where the smart contracts would exist. And this is also where the transactions would take place. So if you're trading some of your tokenized dollars for a tokenized car, that's where the execution would take place. And then from there, it would be registered on the unified ledger. But let's not forget this purple bar on the left-hand side. It says rules, standards, governance. Who do you think sets up the rules as to how you can use your asset? Well, of course, that would be the global elite. So let's go back to the Great Reset agenda. We all know that it's about you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. But you might still own some things, but they will control everything. So it's not really that you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, but it's that you will control nothing and be happy. And they point out that this is managed by the local central bank, and then the BIS would be the central bank of the central banks, but we'll save that rabbit hole for a completely separate video. So the central bank would manage the domestic ledger that would be connected and integrated into the global unified ledger. And in this world, the central bank could extend credit or create currency units for entities in the real economy, whether that's individuals or businesses. And let's remember, they have an infinite balance sheet, so they could extend credit. They could create currency units for whomever they want. In other words, whoever is in political favor at any given time. And as you know, all of the external information is going into their database in real time. And this is how they would obviously implement that social score when they so choose to roll it out. Once everyone's completely addicted to the network, just like you are addicted to your cell phone. Now let's go over some of the use cases that they outline so you can really get an idea of how extensive this would be, because I don't think most people can really grasp the type of power they would have. Overcoming coordination problems may be particularly useful in context of banking. Typical term deposit contracts are bilateral agreements between the bank and the depositor, yet from time to time the value of the deposits can depend on the collective decisions of all the depositors, especially during stress periods in the banking sector. Now, if you don't know what they're talking about a bank run. So if those people that know that the bank is going to fail take out their money in advance, they get 100 cents on the dollar. But those people that weren't paying any attention, that left their money in the bank, they might only get 50 cents on the dollar. Of course, Silicon Valley Bank would be a poster child for this, assuming the government didn't come in and bail out the depositors. But you see, the central planners believe that if you have the power to take your money out of a particular bank that's going to go bust, well, that's a problem. Depositors who withdraw first have thus an advantage, and this can lead to bank runs. This problem could be mitigated by allowing explicit coordination through the design of new types of deposit contracts that impose contingent performance of action on depositors. Such contracts could ensure that early withdrawers did no better than late withdrawers, thus eliminating the motivation to withdraw the funds purely out of fear that others might do the same. So basically what happens is next time you set up a bank account, it includes a smart contract that stipulates that if that bank goes bust, regardless of when you take your money out, you still take the exact same haircut as all the other depositors. Their argument would be this would eliminate bank runs, although effectively it's a bail-in. Anyone with common sense can see that. And of course, if you take your money out first before everyone else, well, that's not fair. And we know that's racist. We know that's transphobic, and we can't allow that.
I know this is sounding terrifying, but I do have some good news for those of you who don't want to participate in Klausville, like all the normies and your friend and family member Freds will likely gravitate toward it like a moth to a flame. I don't think they'll make Bitcoin or gold illegal or silver. I think that you'll still be able to settle outside of the unified ledger. You'll be able to buy a coffee or maybe some steak or eggs from a local farmer in whatever type of money you so choose between the two parties. But it's not going to work if you want to buy private property, if you want to buy an asset that legally needs to be transferred over into your name. So let me give you an example here. So we've got the tokenized dollars, and let's just say this time that we're going to buy a tokenized house on the unified ledger, but that's also going to mean that we are going to take legal ownership of that house in real life. And we are going to have fewer dollars as assets on our balance sheet. Okay, so let's say this house is $500,000. And you say, ha ha, central planners, I have figured out a way around your stupid Orwellian system. I found a seller that will accept Bitcoin, gold, or maybe even silver. And the asking price for the house is $500,000. 500,000 of your stupid tokenized dollars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay them in your system. But I am going to pay them $1. And therefore you are going to have to transfer legal ownership over to me on the ledger. And then the balance, the $499,000, is going to be paid for in whatever form of money we choose. And Klaus isn't going to know about it. Now, this is a pretty good game plan, but what you have to realize is that now the legal record for that transaction for that house would be $1. So when the buyer goes to sell it, let's say in 5 years, I'm doubting that they're going to be able to find someone who is willing to pay for it in the same manner that they bought it. They just got lucky and found a seller that wanted to take their gold, Bitcoin, silver, etc., and do that transaction outside of the system. When we all know most of the normies will want to live within this system, within Klausville, because of the convenience and the advantages we talked about earlier. So if the buyer sells the house in the future for, let's say, $500,000, the same price they paid for it, they're going to have to accept these dollar tokens. And then they're going to have to pay capital gains on the balance. That would be $499,000. And let's assume for a moment we've got a 20% long-term capital gains tax. That means that when the buyer sold in the future, they would be on the hook for another $100,000. How many people would be willing to take that type of hit just to transact outside of the system? Answer, not very many. Now let's go right back to the biggest problems that we face if they implement this global CBDC. That's a big if. That's the good news. We're going to get to that more in step number 3. But I think the biggest problem we're facing is how would you even know they implemented this unified ledger? You see, they're not going to come out and say, hey, we've got this new CBDC system that's going to be Big Brother and Orwell and Social Score. Absolutely not. They're smart enough to know that just the phrase or abbreviation CBDC holds massive negative connotations. It's bad for PR. Therefore, they're not going to come out and tell you what they're doing. So how are you even going to know? You see, the way they're going to roll this out is say, hey, listen, we've got great news. You can go ahead and send your friends money instantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you're going to say, hey, I don't want a CBDC, but if my bank is giving me that type of perk, well, great, why not take it? And then they're going to come out and say, oh, but wait, there is more. It gets even better. Now, not only can you transact with anyone you want instantly, any time of the day, even on holidays, but now if you go overseas, you can go ahead and transfer your dollars right into pesos. And you don't even have to pay a fee. And you don't even have to transfer them to another bank. You can just immediately use this app on your phone. And you say, my gosh, that sounds amazing. Well, thank you very much, Wells Fargo. And then they're going to say, oh, but wait, there is more. Not only can you do all those other awesome things that we talked about instantly, completely free of charge, but if you want to go down and buy a house or a car, you don't even have to fill out any paperwork. In fact, you don't have to go to a title company, nothing. All you have to do is give us a copy of your signature, or maybe press a couple buttons here. Maybe we do some facial recognition with your phone to make sure that it's you. Got to be safe, of course. And then the transaction will happen instantly and the house will be in your name. Well, my gosh, what's not to like? Maybe I've been watching this George Gammon guy's videos, and I don't know, maybe he's just a tinfoil hatter. Maybe he doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, seems to me like the banking system and the government is getting even more efficient than they were before. What's not to like? As long as they don't come out with that central bank digital currency. You see what I'm saying? In fact, let's do another quick thought experiment. How many of you would know right now, as we speak, whether or not you are using a central bank digital currency? If they didn't tell you, how would you know? The answer is you wouldn't. And if you don't even know, then how can you know to even push back? And let's take it one step further. Let's just assume for a moment you somehow were able to tell that you were using a central bank digital currency. Let's say now they come up with a social score or something like that, to where it's completely obvious. Well, who would you push back against? You see, on this channel, and on my Rebel Capitalist channel, we always talk about standing up for freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. And in the past, that was actually very simple to do. It wasn't easy, but it was simple. All you would have to do is stand up and say no. Perfect example would have been the lockdowns of 2020. All we would have had to do as a society is just stand up and say no. And the politicians, the central planners, and authoritarians would have been helpless. The power is always with the people. But let's say this time we stood up and said no. We don't want your central bank digital currency and your stupid unified ledger. Who are we standing up and saying no to? Klaus? How's that going to work? The BIS? The UN? If you can't push back against a specific individual, entity, or government, it's very difficult to move the needle. Because what you're effectively doing is standing up and saying no to decentralized tyranny and decentralized authoritarianism. Because your opponent, in this case the global elite that are actually managing this entire system, are spread out across the globe in multiple jurisdictions. So again, how would you even know that they have implemented a CBDC? And even if you did know, how would you know who to push back against? These are the biggest problems we face as individuals who value freedom, liberty, free market capitalism, and privacy. Step number 3, what can you do to make sure that you can survive and thrive in a world of central bank digital currencies? Let's start off with my slogan that I think sums up the actionable advice that you should be taking right now. Don't hesitate, but navigate. So why do I say this? I'm actually going to disagree slightly with myself. Earlier in this video, I was saying you should be scared as hell. Now, you should be very, very concerned. This should definitely be on your radar. But you shouldn't be paralyzed with fear. You shouldn't hesitate to take action. So what you have to do, don't hesitate, understand that this is coming, and figure out a game plan as to how you can navigate the world, whatever craziness it presents with a CBDC. So let's go over some good news bad news. We'll start with the bad news. A CBDC is coming, bottom line. There are no certainties, there are only probabilities, but I would give this a 99% probability. Now, does it turn out to be this unified ledger the BIS is talking about, or would we just have domestic CBDCs, one in the United States, one in Europe as an example, and then the Fed and the ECB would just connect their ledgers so they would talk to one another, but it doesn't have this kind of global puppeteer like the BIS and the Klausville version of the unified ledger. But my main point is it's going to come. I don't think there's anything that we can do to prevent it. It's just going to be too popular. As far as the features are going to be too popular with the average Joe and the average Jane. But what we do have on our side, here's some good news, is we know the central planners, the governments, the bureaucracies are wildly inefficient. And I would call them completely incompetent. So what is the chance they actually roll this out, especially on a global level? Well, I think the probability of the BIS pulling this off globally is very, very low. That said, I also need to point out the fact that these central planners did set up the Federal Reserve. They did set up the ECB, the Bank of Japan, etc. So on one hand, yes, they're incompetent. But on the other hand, they were able to pull off some monetary centralization in the form of those central banks. Now let's get into the important part. How do you navigate this system regardless of how it plays out? Well, we have to come to the conclusion that most of us will be subject to earning the tokenized dollars that we've been talking about through this video. You have to operate and work within this system. Now, sure, you might be able to find an employer that pays you in gold or cash under the table or Bitcoin, but that's not going to be realistic for the majority of the people watching this video. So the next question becomes, okay, how do I take my purchasing power out of the video game, bring it down into real life so I have a better opportunity to transact for goods and services without the global elite or the unified ledger knowing precisely what I do and when? Well, I think there's two steps here for most people. You've got to take how much you're earning, take these dollars, and if you can, take them straight into cash. Now, I doubt they're going to allow you to do this, but who knows? In a perfect world, or if we had our way, obviously, we would be able to take these tokenized dollars, go to the bank, and still receive green pieces of paper. But let's assume for a moment you cannot do that. So the other alternative would be to take your tokenized dollars and go ahead and exchange them for Bitcoin. This is assuming that you can do this peer-to-peer or that the on-ramps and off-ramps are still available. If you can't do that, then go ahead and trade your tokens or what you don't use paying your bills, what you have left, you can turn that into gold. And what's nice about gold, especially, is there are a lot of opportunities to turn that gold right back into the cash that you would need to transact daily. Now, you can do this with Bitcoin as well, but I talked to a few of my friends in the space, and right now, it's just pretty much strictly peer-to-peer, a little cumbersome. You could do this at maybe a Bitcoin cafe, or you can go to a Bitcoin ATM and do this, where you can basically sell your Bitcoin. I think they use a QR code, and then it just literally spits out cash. And I know a lot of you really like Bitcoin and like gold, rightfully so, or silver. Forgot about silver. But the reality is you can't go a week and pay all of your bills and expenses with Bitcoin or silver or gold. It's just not going to happen. It's not realistic. So I see this as more of a store of value. And then when you need to transact, buy goods and services, go ahead and trade that store of value for those green pieces of paper, and then buy as much stuff as you possibly can. And then these folks, the video game doesn't know what you're doing. They can't track that. Unfortunately, there is a problem. If I am Klaus, as an example, with cash, I see risks there to my precious, precious social credit score. So what I would do is I would put up a point of sale at all of the vendors or all these businesses. So you would have to be identified before you paid. So regardless of whether you pay with Bitcoin or cash or silver or tokenized dollars, they still know exactly who you are and what you buy. Now, if they ban dollars, we still have some alternatives. I'd like to point out a Twitter profile that I came across, and I do believe they have a website. It's called cashmatters.org. And I don't know them personally, but it really looks like they're fighting the good fight. So you definitely want to check them out. And they pointed out that North Carolina, as an example, is trying to push through laws that would make it illegal for businesses not to accept cash. So this is good news. And I'd also like to point out that if you have the resources, if you have the ability, you might want to check out some emerging markets as a plan B. Places such as Romania, Morocco, maybe right here in Colombia where I am. I just did some research the other day that showed that in Romania, 75% plus of the transactions are settled in good old-fashioned hard currency. In Morocco, can't remember the number right off the top of my head, but I think it was over 60%. And I know from personal experience right here in Colombia, the number is incredibly high, especially once you get a couple miles outside of the city centers. So the probability that they even implement a CBDC in the next 5 years or so is pretty low. And the probability that they would completely ban cash, have a point of sale system, or a QR code attached to that is even lower. Another thing that I want to highlight, and this is key, is that in this CBDC world, jurisdiction is going to matter a lot, because I don't think there's any way of getting around the fact that if the central planners want you to have a social score, you're going to have a social score. But does it really matter? Because if you have a social score and you live, let's say, in the state of Texas, and they don't even acknowledge a social score, does it matter? It's not part of your daily life. Now, if you live in New York, it's definitely going to matter. Or if you live in California, as an example. I look at it a lot like the cerveza sickness. Remember, there were a lot of businesses and the government, they forced all of their employees to inject the foreign substance into their vein. And remember, you had to have a card. But if you had a card in Texas, nobody cared about it. But if you had that card in New York, you would have to show it just to get into restaurants. So the bottom line is Klaus may have all the data in the world, and he may even give you a social score in Klausville. But if you live in some place like Texas, it might not even matter if the local sheriff, the local politician, the local government doesn't acknowledge it. So you navigate a CBDC world by earning the tokenized dollars up here, and then once you earn them, you take them out of the ecosystem, put them into a store of value, whichever you prefer, and then when you need to transact, take that store of value and turn it into cash. Understand, though, that they could implement a point of sale system, a QR code. They're definitely going to try to ban cash. But the good news is there's a lot of jurisdictions that may never ban cash, and there are a lot of opportunities to get outside of the developed world where the probability of them implementing this type of Orwellian system is a heck of a lot lower. And even if they do it, it's going to take a lot longer. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here. I will see you on the next video.